This is a discussion about the metabolism worksheet that you were passed out in class, although you can also get it online. So if you're looking at your diagram, on the far left over here are the things that you eat. So you eat fats, carbs, and proteins, but what you probably think about eating is like oil or meat or spaghetti. But regardless of what you call it, whether you call it spaghetti or starch or carbohydrates, the things that you eat are the macromolecules. And they're written in red here in the second column with the official macromolecule title, so you can see protein, carbohydrate or polysaccharide, and triglyceride. And you should know the forms of the carbohydrates, for example. Cellulose, starch, and glycogen are the three forms of carbohydrate. Starch is mostly what we eat, although we do eat cellulose, we don't digest it well, and we call it fiber. And glycogen is another form of a carbohydrate that humans and animals make, but we rarely eat it because there's not a lot of stored carbohydrate or glycogen in, for example, beef muscle. Okay, so the macromolecules are here in red, and the digestive system functions to take the macromolecule and break them down to the building blocks, which in this diagram are in green. So the building blocks of triglycerides are fatty acids, the building blocks of carbohydrates are glucose, and the building blocks of proteins are amino acids. Something you should know and you should remember from A&P 1 as well as our discussion in class. Now, we're going to focus right here on the middle section. Okay, so what I'm highlighting in red right here. Just look at this for a minute. Glucose, or monosaccharide like glucose, is broken down to pyruvate in a step called glycolysis. You probably remember glycolysis at least mentioned in A&P 1 when you talked about muscle metabolism. But glycolysis can take place in any cell. It happens in the cytoplasm. It's 9 steps, 9 enzymes, and you get pyruvate and approximately 2 ATP, which is cell energy. You don't need oxygen. You don't need any special organelle. It happens right in the cytoplasm, so any cell can do it. But 2 ATP is not enough to live on. So if you want more energy from that molecule of glucose, you have to continue to break the pyruvate down. So glycolysis is the first step of cellular respiration, but if you really want to get any ATP, you need to do all 3 steps of cellular respiration, and that would be glycolysis first, then the Krebs cycle right here, and then the electron transport system. If you do all 3, you're going to end up with approximately 36 to 38 ATP, so 17 to 18 times more ATP if you do all 3 steps versus just glycolysis. Okay, so you have this molecule of glucose and you have oxygen around, so you can continue to do cellular respiration, and you break it down, pyruvate to acetyl-CoA, which goes through the Krebs cycle to generate electrons, usually carried by NADH and FADH, which passes those electrons through the electron transport system and generates heat, water, and a whole bunch of ATP, which is the goal of cellular respiration, to get energy. From pyruvate on, from that step on, you absolutely have to have mitochondria, and you have to have oxygen, which of course in a normal breathing person, we breathe in oxygen. Every cell except red blood cells have mitochondria, so most cells can break glucose down to water, heat, and ATP. And it's a very efficient process. It takes enzymes along each step. And of course you need the mitochondria to do the second 2 steps. The main waste product from the Krebs cycle is carbon dioxide, which we exhale at the same time that we're inhaling oxygen. So we inhale oxygen, and when we exhale, out goes the CO2. So in a normal person, this takes place at rest. It just takes place faster when you exercise. Okay, so the step right here, pyruvate to acetyl-CoA, notice that the arrow is in red. This is a step that's irreversible. Once a molecule is converted from pyruvate to acetyl-CoA, it cannot go back to pyruvate. Pyruvate, however, if there's no oxygen around, will be broken down, for example, to lactic acid, which is what happens in muscle cells when there's not enough oxygen. You can also take that pyruvate and make glucose from it in a process called gluconeogenesis, which means making new glucose. Gluco for glucose, neo, new, genesis, create or make. So if you want to make glucose, you have to start with pyruvate. You cannot start with acetyl-CoA because, again, this red arrow only goes one way. Alright, so let's say you ate a hamburger, and that hamburger has a bun, which we just talked about how to break that down to ATP and energy, but it also has some fat and some protein. So you got meat, and you got some fat on there, some cheese and mayonnaise and whatever. The meat, or the protein, is broken down to amino acids by the digestive system, and amino acids have a nitrogen molecule. Okay, there's CH and O, but there's nitrogen, and so if you want to feed it into cellular respiration, you got to get rid of that nitrogen. And removing of that nitrogen is called deamination. And you're left with the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen backbone and the nitrogen, which comes off of an amino acid in the form of ammonia. Our livers convert that to urea, and urea is lost by the urinary system when you urinate. So it's easy, or maybe not easy, but our body has a great way of getting rid of that nitrogen waste. What's left over, this carbon, hydrogen, oxygen molecule, feeds up into the system at various locations depending on which amino acid you started with. Remember, there's 20 amino acids, and some of them are converted directly to acetyl-CoA, some into pyruvate, and some into various intermediate steps between glucose and pyruvate, that glycolysis step. So you could use this backbone, if you converted it to pyruvate, to make glucose. If it is made into acetyl-CoA or feeds into the Krebs cycle, it's too late. You can't go back to glucose. Alright, so we'll leave off there and go back up here to the fats. So you ate some cheese in that hamburger, it's converted to fatty acids by the digestive system, and fatty acids are broken down to acetyl-CoA in a process called beta oxidation. Beta oxidation requires oxygen. Okay, you need oxygen for that step to happen. So if you want to burn a fat, you got to have oxygen, which is why aerobics is so popular, or became popular in the 80s, because they figured this out. You cannot run a marathon and burn fat. You need to be breathing enough to get oxygen to those tissues if you actually want to burn a fat. So all fatty acids are burned to acetyl-CoA. And then, of course, it can go through the Krebs cycle, electron transport, you get ATP, heat, and water. The body does not know whether acetyl-CoA started out as a piece of cheese, the bun, or the bread, or I'm sorry, the meat. So regardless of which one you ate, once it gets to acetyl-CoA, the body's like, who cares? You know, I'm just going to take that acetyl-CoA, I'm going to generate some ATP by putting it through the Krebs cycle and then the electron transport system in the mitochondria. So ATP can come from any of the macromolecules that you eat. Alright, so let's go back again to this acetyl-CoA. So a cell has taken in some nutrients, and we don't even care whether it was a fatty acid, a glucose, or an amino acid, and generated acetyl-CoA. If that cell does not need any more ATP, what are you going to do with it? Okay, now the cell is going to generate ATP until it meets all its energy requirements and it has enough energy to build everything it needs to build and be happy. But we tend to generate a lot more acetyl-CoA than we need to generate ATP because we eat more than we need energy for. So when acetyl-CoA builds up in the cell and energy is not needed, it is stored this direction. It is converted back to a fatty acid, which is stored as triglycerides in your adipose tissue. The only way acetyl-CoA can go, besides burning it for energy, is a fat. It cannot be converted to pyruvate, remember, and it does not go back to any of the amino acid structures. It can only go this way, fatty acid synthesis, which is depressing because as soon as you eat one extra molecule of whatever, whether it was a Twinkie or a piece of broccoli, that extra acetyl-CoA is stored as fat. So you can convert sugars to fat, proteins to fat, and of course you can store fat as fat, but you cannot take a sugar or an amino acid you can't take anything backwards from acetyl-CoA to glucose. You can make glucose, but you can't make it from acetyl-CoA. So a fat cannot turn into a sugar, but sugar can turn into fat. So make sure before you stop looking at this diagram, all the blue things here are processes, and you should know the definitions of those and what is happening. And you should remember this key right here. Pyruvate, once it's converted to acetyl-CoA, cannot go back. So anytime you have extra acetyl-CoA, it's stored as fat.